Hi, my name is Justin Prevost, and welcome back to my YouTube channel of Marxist/Radical Readings. If you could please hit that like and or subscribe button, as I will have more audiobooks in the future. And with that out of the way, let's get started. The Right to be Lazy by Paul LaFargue. Anti-copyright 1883 through 2020. No rights reserved. This book is encouraged to be reprinted and stolen and made accessible by any means necessary. A radical reprint. Preface. Mr. Thiers, at a private session of the Commission on Primary Education of 1849 said, quote, "I wish to make the influence of the clergy all-powerful because I count upon it to propagate that good philosophy which teaches man that he is here below to suffer, and not that other philosophy, which on the contrary bids man to enjoy," unquote. Mr. Thiers was stating the ethics of the capitalist class, whose fierce egoism and narrow intelligence he incarnated. The bourgeoisie, when it was struggling against the nobility, sustained by the clergy, hoisted the flag of free thought and atheism, but once triumphant, it changed its tone and manner, and today it uses religion to support its economic and political supremacy. In the 15th and 16th centuries, it had joyfully taken up the pagan tradition and glorified the flesh and its passions. Reproved by Christianity in our days, gored with goods and with pleasures, it denied the teachings of its thinkers like Rabelais and de Toro. I'm not too sure how to pronounce these two names, but I'm assuming it's Rabelais and Diderot, and preaches abstinence to the wage workers. Capitalist Ethics, a pitiful parody on Christian ethics, strikes with the anathema, the flesh of the laborer. Its ideal is to reduce the producer to the smallest number of needs, to suppress his joys and his passions, and to condemn him to play the part of a machine, turning out work without respite and without thanks. The revolutionary socialists must take up again the battle fought by the philosophers and pamphleteers of the bourgeoisie. They must march up to the assault of the ethics and the social theories of capitalism. They must demolish in the heads of the class which they call to action the prejudices sown in them by the ruling class. They must proclaim in the faces of the hypocrites of all ethical systems that the earth shall cease to be the vale of tears for the laborer, that in the communist society of the future, which we shall establish, quote, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must, unquote, the impulses of men will be given a free rein, for, quote, all these impulses are by nature good, we have nothing to avoid but their misuse and their excesses, unquote. And they will not be avoided except by their mutual counterbalancing, by the harmonious development of the human organism, for as Dr. Bedeau says, quote, it is only when a race reaches its maximum of physical development that it arrives at its highest point of energy and moral vigor, unquote. Such was also the opinion of the great naturalist Charles Darwin. This refutation of the, quote, right to work, unquote, which I am republishing with some additional notes, appeared in the weekly Egalit 1880 second series, PL. Chapter 1. A Disastrous Dogma. Let us be lazy in everything, except in loving and drinking, except in being lazy. Lessing. A strange delusion possesses the working classes of the nations where capitalist civilization holds its sway. This delusion drags in its train the individual and social woes which for 2 centuries have tortured sad humanity. This delusion is the love of work, the furious passion for work, pushed even to the exhaustion of the vital force of the individual and his progency. Instead of opposing this mental aberration, the priests, the economists, and the moralists have cast a sacred halo over work, blind and finite men. They have wished to be wiser than their God. Weak and contemptible men, they have presumed to rehabilitate what their God had cursed. I, who do not profess to be a Christian, an economist, or a moralist, I appeal from their judgment to that of their God, from the preachings of their religious, economics, or free thought ethics, to the frightful consequences of work in capitalist society. In capitalist society, work is the cause of all intellectual degeneracy, of all organic deformity. Compare the thoroughbred in Rothschild's stables, served by a retinue of bipeds, with the heavy brute of the Norman farms which plows the earth, carts the manure, hauls the crops. Look at the noble savage whom the missionaries of trade and the traders of religion have not yet corrupted with Christianity, syphilis, and the dogma of work, and then look at our miserable slaves of machines. When in our civilized Europe we would find a trace of the native beauty of man, we must go seek it in the nations where economic prejudices have not uprooted the hatred of work. Spain, which, alas, is degenerating, may still boast of possessing fewer factories than we have of prisons and barracks, but the artist rejoices in his admiration of the hardy, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Andalusian brown as his native chestnuts, straight and flexible as a steel rod, and the heart leaps at hearing the beggar, superbly draped in his ragged capa, parleying on terms of equality with the Duke of Osuna. For the Spaniard, in whom the primitive animal has not been atrophied, work is the worst sort of slavery. The Greeks, in their era of greatness, had only contempt for work. Their slaves alone were permitted to labor. The free man knew only exercises for the body and mind, and so it was in this era that men like Aristotle, Phidias, Aristophanes moved and breathed among the people. It was the time when a handful of heroes at Marathon crushed the hordes of Asia, soon to be subdued by Alexander. The philosophers of antiquity taught contempt for work, that degeneration of the free man. The poets sang of idleness, that gift from the gods. O Melibe, dies nobis heic otia facit. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, preached idleness. Quote, Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow; they toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Unquote. Jehovah, the bearded and angry God, gave his worshippers the supreme example of ideal laziness. After 6 days of work, he rests for all eternity. On the other hand, what are the races for which work is an organic necessity? The I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but I'm assuming it's the Auvergnans, Auvergnans, the Auvergnans, the Scotch, those Auvergnans of the British Isles, the Galatians, the Auvergnans of Spain, the Pomeranians, those those Auvergnans of Germany, the Chinese, those Auvergnans of Asia, in our society, which are the classes that love work for work's sake, the peasant proprietors, the little shopkeepers, the former bent double over their fields, the latter crouched in their shops, burrow like the mole in his subterranean passage, and never stand up to look at nature leisurely. And meanwhile, the proletariat, the great class embracing all the producers of civilized nations, the class which is freeing itself, will free humanity from servile toil and will make of the human animal a free being. The proletariat, betraying its instincts, despising its historic mission, has let itself be perverted by the dogma of work. Rude and terrible has been its punishment. All its individual and social woes are born of its passion for work. And then we have footnotes here. So it says, 1. European explorers pause in wonder before the physical beauty and the proud bearing of the men of primitive races, not soiled by what Papin calls, quote, the poisonous breath of civilization, unquote. Speaking of the, again, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, aborigines of the oceanic islands, Lord George Campbell writes, quote, there is not a people in the world which strikes one more favorably at first sight. Their smooth skin of a light copper tint, their hair golden and curly, their beautiful and happy faces, in a word, their whole person formed a new and splendid specimen of the quote genus Homo, unquote. Their physical appearance gave the impression of a race superior to ours, unquote. The civilized men of ancient Rome witness Caesar and Tacitus regarded with the same admiration the Germans of the communist tribes which invaded the Roman Empire. Following Tacitus, Salvian, the priest of the 5th century, who received the surname of Master of the Bishops, held up the barbarians as an example to civilized Christians. Quote, we are immodest before the barbarians, who are more chaste than we. Even more, the barbarians are wounded at our lack of modesty. The Goths do not permit debauchees of their own nation to remain among them. Alone in the midst of them, by the sad privilege of their nationality and their name, the Romans have the right to be impure. Parentheses. Pederasty was then the height of the fashion among both pagans and Christians. On parentheses. The oppressed fly to the barbarians to seek the mercy and a shelter, unquote. Parentheses. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this. This is definitely German, though. Or, I'm sorry, no, not German. Oh, yeah, it might be German. De Nation de, on parentheses. The old civilization and the rising Christianity corrupted the barbarians of the ancient world, as the old Christianity and the modern capitalist civilization are corrupting the savages of the New World. M. F. Laplace, whose talent for observation must be recognized, even if we reject his sociological conclusions, tainted with philanthropic, and Christian uh, Pharisaeum, Phariseums. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I think it's Phariseums, or I'm sorry, Pharasium. Says in his book. Says in his hook. Les Ouvriers Europeans (1885) on parentheses quote the propensity of the backers for laziness (parentheses the backers are semi-nomadic shepherds of the Asiatic slope of the Ural Mountains (on parentheses). The leisure of nomadic life, the habit of meditation, which this engenders in the best endowed individuals. All this often gives them a distinction of manner, a fineness of intelligence and judgment, which is rarely to be observed on the same social level in a more developed civilization. The thing most repugnant to them is agricultural labor. They will do anything rather than accept the trade of a farmer, unquote. Agriculture is, in fact, the first example of servile labor in the history of man. According to biblical tradition, the first criminal, Cain, is a farmer. 2. The Spanish proverb says, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but I'm assuming it's descansar es salud, parentheses, rest is healthful, on parentheses. Chapter 2, Blessings of Work. In 1770, at London, an anonymous pamphlet appeared under the title An Essay on Trade and Commerce. It made some stir in its time. The author, a great philanthropist, was indignant that, quote, the factory population of England had taken into its head the fixed idea that in their quality of Englishmen, all the individuals composing it have by right of birth the privilege of being freer and more independent than the laborers of any country in Europe. This idea may have its usefulness for soldiers, since it stimulates their valor, but the less the factory workers are imbued with it, the better for themselves and the state. Laborers ought never to look on themselves as independent of their superiors. It is extremely dangerous to encourage such infatuations in a commercial state like ours, where perhaps 7/8 of the population have little or no poverty. The cure will not be complete until our industrial laborers are contented to work 6 days for the same sum which they now earn in 4, unquote. Thus, nearly a century before, don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Goizat, work was openly preached in London as a curb to the noble passions of man. Quote, the more my people work, the less vices they will have, unquote, wrote Napoleon on May 5th of 1807. Wrote Napoleon on May 5th, 1807, from Osterode. Quote, I am the authority, and I should be disposed to order that on Sunday, after the hour of service be past, the shops be opened, and the laborers return to their work, unquote, to root out laziness and curb the sentiments of pride and independence which arise from it. The author of the essay on trade proposed to imprison the poor in ideal, quote, workhouses, unquote, which should become, quote, houses of terror, where they should work 14 hours a day in such fashion that when mealtime was deducted, there should remain 12 hours of work, full and complete, unquote. 12 hours of work a day, that is the ideal of the philanthropists and moralists of the 18th century. How have we outdone this nec plus ultra? Modern factories have become ideal houses of correction in which the toiling masses are imprisoned, in which they are condemned to compulsory work for 12 or 14 hours, not the men only, but also women and children. And to think that the sons of the heroes of the terror have allowed themselves to be degraded by the religion of work to the point of accepting, since 1848, as a revolutionary conquest, the law limiting factory labor to 12 hours. They proclaim as a revolutionary principle the right to work. Shame to the French proletariat. Only slaves would have been capable of such baseness. A Greek of the heroic times would have required 20 years of capitalist civilization before he could have conceived such vileness. And if the miseries of compulsory work and the tortures of hunger have descended upon the proletariat more in number than the locusts of the Bible, it is because the proletariat itself invited them. This work, which in June 1848 the laborers demanded the arms of their hands, this they have imposed on their families. They have delivered up to the barons of industry their wives and children. With their own hands, they have demolished their domestic hearths. With their own hands, they have dried up the milk of their wives. The unhappy women carrying and nursing their babies have been obliged to go into the mines and factories to bend their backs and exhaust their nerves. With their own hands, they have broken the life and the vigor of their children. Shame on the proletarians. Where are those neighborly housewives told of in our fables and in our old tales? Bold and frank of speech, lovers of, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, lovers of Bacchus or Bacchus. Where are those buxom girls, always on the move, always cooking, always singing, always spreading life, engendering life's joy, giving painless birth to healthy and vigorous children? Today we have factory girls and women, pale drooping flowers, and impoverished blood, with disordered stomachs. With languid limbs, they have never known the pleasure of a healthy passion, nor would they be capable of telling of it merrily. And the children? 12 hours of work for children, zero misery, but not all the Jules Simon of the Academy of Moral and Political Science, not all the Germanies of Jesuitism, could have invented a vice more degrading to the intelligence of the children, more corrupting of their instincts, more destructive of their organism, than work in the vitiated atmosphere of the capitalist factory. Our epoch has been called the century of work. It is in fact the century of pain, misery, and corruption. And all the while, the philosophers, the bourgeois economists, from the painfully confused Auguste Comte or Comte to the ludicrously clear Leroy Beaulieu, the people of bourgeois literature, from the quickishly romantic Victor Hugo to the artlessly grotesque Paul de Kock, all have instoned nauseating, I believe. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the word, nauseating, songs in honor of the god Progress. The oldest son of work, listen to them and you would think that happiness was soon to reign over the earth, that its coming was already perceived. They rummaged in the dust of in the dust of past centuries to bring back feudal miseries, to serve as a somber contrast to the delights of the present times. Have they wearied us? These satisfied people, yesterday pensioners at the table of the nobility, today pen valets of the capitalist class, and fatly paid? Have they reckoned us weary of the peasant, such as Le Bruyere? Describe him. Well, here is the brilliant picture of proletarian delights in the year of capitalist progress, 1840, penned by one of their own men, Dr. Villerm, member of the Institute, the same who in 1848 was a member of that scientific society, parentheses, Thiers' cousin, Passy Blanc, or Blanquet, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, the academician were in it, on parentheses, which disseminated among the masses the nonsense of bourgeois economics and ethics. It is of manufacturing Alsace that Dr. Villerm speaks. The Alsace of Kestner and Dollfuss, those flowers of industrial philanthropy and republicanism. But before the doctor raises up before us his picture of proletarian miseries, let us listen to an Alsatian manufacturer, Mr. Th. Mieg of the House of Dollfuss, Mieg and Company, depicting the condition of the old-time artisan, quote, at Mulhouse 50 years ago, parentheses, in 1813, when modern mechanical industry was just arising, on parentheses. The laborers were all children of the soil, inhabiting the town and the surrounding villages, and almost all owning a house and often a little field, unquote. It was the golden age of the laborer, but at the time, Alsatian industry did not deluge the world with its cottons, nor make millionaires out of its Dollfuss and Cochlin, assuming that's pronounced. But 25 years after, when Villerm visited Alsace, the modern Minotaur, the capitalist workshop, had conquered the country. In its insatiable appetite for human labor, it had dragged the workmen from their hearths, the better to wring them and press out the labor which they contained. It was by thousands that the workers flocked together at the signal of the steam whistle. A great number, says Villerm, 5,000, and of 17,000 were obliged by high rents to lodge in neighboring villages. Some of them lived 3 3 or 4 miles from the factory where they worked. At Mulhouse in Dornach, work began at 5 o'clock in the morning and ended at 8 o'clock in the evening, summer and winter. It was a sight to watch them arrive each morning into the city and depart each evening. Among them were a multitude of women, pale, often walking barefooted through the mud, and who, for lack of umbrellas, when the rain or snow fell, wore their aprons or skirts turned up. Over their heads, there was a still larger number of young children, equally dirty, equally pale, covered with rags, greasy, and from the machine oil which drops on them while they work. They were better protected from the rain because their clothes shed water. But unlike the women just mentioned, they did not carry their day's provisions in a basket, but they carried in their hands or hid under their clothing as best they might the morsel of bread which must serve them as food until time for them to return home. Thus to the strain of an insufferably long day, at least 15 hours is added. For these wretches, the fatigue of the painful daily painful daily journeys. Consequently, they reach home, overwhelmed by the need of sleep, and next day they rise before they completely rested in order to reach the factory by the opening time. Now, look at the holes in which were packed those who lodge in the town. Quote, I saw at Mulhouse in Dornach and the neighboring houses some of those miserable lodgings where two families slept each in its corner on straw thrown on the floor and kept in its place by two planks. This wretchedness among the laborers of the cotton industry in the department of the Upper Rhine is so extreme that it produces this sad result, that while in the families of the manufacturers, merchants, shopkeepers, or factory superintendents, half of the children reach their 21st year, this same half ceases to exist before the lapse of 2 years in the families of weavers and cotton spinners, unquote. Speaking of the labor of the workshop, Villerm adds, quote, it is not a work, a task. It is a torture, and it is inflicted on children of 6 to 8 years. It is this long torture day after day which wastes away the laborers in the cotton spinning factories, unquote. And as the duration of the work, Villerm observes that the convicts in prison work but 10 hours. The slaves in the West Indies work but 9 hours. While there existed in France, after its revolution in 1789, which had proclaimed the pompous rights of man, quote, factories where the day was 16 hours, out of which the laborers were allowed only an hour and a half for meals, unquote. What a miserable abortion of the revolutionary principles of the bourgeoisie. What woeful gifts from its God, progress. The philanthropists hail as benefactors of humanity those who, having done nothing to become rich, give work to the poor. Far better were it to scatter pestilence and to poison the springs than to erect a capitalist factory in the midst of a rural population, introduce factory work, and farewell joy, health, and liberty. Farewell to all that makes life beautiful and worth living. And the economists go on repeating to the laborers, quote, work to increase social wealth, unquote. And nevertheless, an economist, d'Astute de Tracy, answers, quote, "It is in poor nations that people are comfortable, in rich nations they are ordinarily poor," unquote. And his disciple, don't know how to pronounce this, Cherbuliez, continues, quote, "The laborers themselves in cooperating toward the accumulation of productive capital contribute to the event which sooner or later must deprive them of a part of their wages," unquote. But deafened and stupefied by their own howlings, the economists answer, quote, always work to create your prosperity," unquote. And in the name of Christian meekness, a priest of the Anglican Church, the Reverend Mr. Townsend, intones, "Work, work, night and day. By working you make your poverty increase, and your poverty releases us from imposing work upon you by force of law. The legal imposition of work," quote, "gives too much trouble, requires too much violence, and makes too much noise. Hunger, on the contrary, is not only a pleasure which is peaceful, silent and incessant, but as it is the most natural motive for work and industry, it also provokes to the most powerful efforts," unquote. "Work, work, proletarians, to increase social wealth and your individual poverty. Work, work, in order that, becoming poorer, you may have more reason to work and become miserable. Such is the inexorable law of capitalist production. Because lending ear to the fallacious words of the economists, the proletarians have given themselves up, body and soul, to the vice of work. They precipitate the whole of society into these industrial crises of overproduction, which convulse the social organism. Then, because there is a plethora of merchandise and a dearth of purchasers, the shops are closed, and hunger scourges the working people with its whip of 1,000 lashes. The proletarians, brutalized by the dogma of work, not understanding that the overwork which they have inflicted upon themselves during the time of pretended prosperity in the cause of their present misery, do not run to the granaries of wheat and cry, quote, "We are hungry, we wish to eat. True, we have not a red cent, but beggars as we are, it is we, nevertheless, who harvested the wheat and gathered the grapes," unquote. They do not besiege the warehouse of Bonnet or Jujuro, the inventor of industrial convents, and cry out, quote, "M. Bonnet, here are your working women, silk workers, spinners, weavers. They are shivering pitifully under their patched cotton dresses. Yet it is they who have spun and woven the silk robes of the fashionable women of all Christendom. The poor creatures, working 13 hours a day, had no time to think of their toilet. Now they are out of work and have time to rustle in the silks they have made. Ever since they lost their milk teeth, they have devoted themselves to your fortune, and have lived in abstinence. Now they are now they are at leisure and wish to enjoy a little of the fruits of their labor. Come, M. Bonnet, give them your silks. M. Harmel shall furnish his muslins. M. Poyer Coitier his calicos. M. Pinet his boots for their dear little feet, cold and damp, clad from top to toe, and gleeful, they will be delightful to look at. Come, no evasions. You are a friend of humanity, are you not? And a Christian into the bargain. Put at the disposal of your working girls the fortune they have built up for you out of their flesh. You want to help business, get your goods into circulation. Here are consumers ready at hand. Give them unlimited credit. You are simply compelled to give credit to merchants whom you do not who you do not know from Adam or Eve, who have given you nothing, not even a glass of water. Your working women will pay the debt the best they can. If at maturity they let their notes go to protest, and if they have nothing to attach, you can demand that they pay you in prayers. They will send you to paradise better than your black-gowned priests, steeped in tobacco, unquote. Instead of taking advantage of periods of crisis for a general distribution of their products and a universal holiday, the laborers perishing with hunger go and beat their heads against the doors of the workshops. With pale faces, emaciated bodies, pitiful speeches, they assail the manufacturers. Quote, good M. Chagot, sweet M. Schneider, give us work. It is not hunger, but the passion for work which torments us, unquote. And these wretches, who have scarcely the strength to stand upright, sell 12 and 14 hours of work, twice as cheap as when they had bread on the table. And the philanthropists of industry profit by their lockouts to manufacture at lower cost. If industrial crises follow periods of overwork as inevitably as night follows day, bringing after them lockouts and poverty without end, they also lead to inevitable bankruptcy. So long as the manufacturer has credit, he gives free rein to the rage for work. He borrows and borrows again to furnish raw material to his laborers, and goes on producing without considering that the market is becoming sustained, and that if his goods don't happen to be sold, his notes will still come due. At his wits' end, he implores the banker. He throws himself at his feet, offering his blood, his honor, quote, a little gold will do my business better, unquote. Answers the Rothschild, quote, you have 20,000 pairs of hose in your warehouse. They are worth 20 cents. I will take them at 4 cents, unquote. The banker gets possession of the goods and sells them at 6 cents or 8 cents, and pockets certainly frisky dollars which owe nothing to anybody, but the manufacturer has stepped back for a better leap. At last, the crash comes, and the warehouses disgorge. Then so much merchandise is thrown out of the window that you cannot imagine how it came in by the door. Hundreds of millions are required to figure the value of the goods that are destroyed. In the last century, they were burned or thrown into the water. But before reaching this decision, the manufacturers travel the world over in search of markets for the goods, which are heaping up. They force their government to annex Congo, to seize on Tonkin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Tonkin, to battle down the Chinese wall with cannon shots, to make an outlet for their cotton goods. In previous centuries, it was a duel to the death between France and England, as to which should have the exclusive privilege of selling to America and the Indies. Thousands of young and vigorous men reddened and seized with their blood during the colonial wars of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. There is a surplus of capital as well as of goods. The financiers no longer know where to place it. Then they go among the happy nations who are leafing in the sun, smoking cigarettes, and they lay down railroads, erect factories, and import the curse of work. And this exportation of French capital ends one fine morning in diplomatic complications. In Egypt, for example, France, England, and Germany were on the point of hair pulling to decide which insurers shall be paid first. Or it ends with wars like that in Mexico, where French soldiers are sent to play the part of constables to collect bad debts. These individual and social miseries, however, great and innumerable they may be, however eternal they appear, will vanish, like hyenas and jackals at the approach of the lion. When the proletariat shall say, quote, "I will," unquote, but to arrive at the realization of its strength, the proletariat must trample underfoot the prejudices of Christian ethics, economic ethics, and free thought ethics. It must return to its natural instincts. It must proclaim the rights of laziness, 1,000 times more noble and more sacred than the anemic rights of man concocted by the metaphysical lawyers of the bourgeois revolution. It must accustom itself to working but 3 hours a day, reserving the rest of the day and night for leisure and feasting. Thus far my task has been easy. I have had but to describe real evils, well known, alas, by all of us, but to convince the proletariat that the ethics inoculated into it is wicked, that the unbridled work to which it has given itself up the last 100 years in the most terrible scourge that has ever struck humanity, that work will become a mere condiment to the pleasures of idleness, a beneficial exercise to the human organism, a passion useful to the social organism only when wisely regulated and limited to a maximum of 3 hours a day. This is an arduous task beyond my strength. Only communist physiologists, hygienists, and economists could undertake it. In the following pages, I shall merely try to show that given the modern means of production and their unlimited reproductive power, it is necessary to curb the extravagant passion of the laborers for work and to oblige them to consume the goods which they produce. And then we have footnotes here. It says, 1. At the first Congress of Charities held at Brussels in 1817, here, let me get a drink of my water. Brussels in 1817, one of the richest manufacturers of marquite near Lille, M. Scrive, to the plaudits of the members of the Congress, declared with the noble satisfaction of a duty performed, quote, "We have introduced certain methods of diversion for the children. We teach them to sing during their work, also to count while working," unquote. That distracts them and makes them accept bravely, quote, "those 12 hours of labor which are necessary to procure their means of existence," unquote. 12 hours of labor and such labor imposed on children less than 12 years old. The materialists will always regret that there is no hell in which to confine these Christian philanthropic murderers of childhood. 2. Speech delivered from the International Society of Practical Studies in Social Economics at Paris in May 1863 and published in the French Economist or the same epoch. 3. L.R. Villerme, Tableau de l'état physique et moral des ouvriers dans les fabriques de coton, de laine et de soie, or soie, I'm not sure. 1840, anyway. It is not because Dolphus Koechlin and other Alsatian manufacturers were Republicans, patriots, and Protestant philanthropists that they treated their laborers in this way. For Blanqui, the academician Raybaud, the prototype of Jerome Patureau and Jules Simon, have observed the same amenities for the working class among the very Catholic and monarchical manufacturers of Lille and Lyons. These are capitalist virtues which harmonize delightfully with all political and religious convictions. 4. The Indians of the warlike tribes of Brazil kill their invalids and old people. They show their affection for them by putting an end to a life which is no longer enlivened by combats, feasts, and dances. All primitive peoples have given these proofs of affection to their relatives. The Massagetae of the Caspian Sea, parentheses, Herodotus on parentheses, as well as the Wends of Germany and the Celts of Gaul. In the churches of Sweden, even lately, they preserved clubs called family clubs, which served to deliver parents from the sorrows of old age. How degenerate are the modern proletarians to accept with patience the terrible miseries of factory labor. 5. At the Industrial Congress held in Berlin in January 21st, 1879, the losses in the iron industry of Germany during the last crisis were estimated at $109,056,000. 6. M. Clemenceau's Justice said on April 6, 1880, in its financial department, quote, "We have heard this opinion maintained that even without pressure the billions of the War of 1870 would have been equally lost for France. That is under the form of loans periodically put out to balance the budgets of foreign countries. This is also our opinion." Unquote. The loss of English capital on loans of South American republics is estimated at $1 billion. The French laborers not only produced the $1 billion paid Bismarck, but they continued to pay interest on the war indemnity to Olivier Girardin, I think, Bazaine, and other income drawers who brought on the war and the rout. Nevertheless, they still have they still have one shred of consolation. These billions will not bring on a war of reprisal. Chapter 3. The Consequences of Overproduction. A Greek poet of Cicero's time, Antipteros, thus sang of the invention of the watermill (parentheses, for grinding grain), (unparentheses), which was to free the slave women, the slave women, and bring back the golden age. Quote, "Spare the arm which turns the mill, 0 millers, and sleep peacefully. Let the cock warn you in vain that day is breaking." Demeter has imposed upon the nymphs, the labor of the slaves, and behold them leaping merrily over the wheel, and behold the axle tree shaken, turning with its spokes, and making the heavy rolling stone revolve. Let us live the life of our fathers, and let us rejoice in idleness over the gifts that the goddess grants us. Unquote. Alas, the leisure which the pagan poet announced has not come. The blind, perverse, and murderous passion for work transforms the liberating machine into an instrument for the enslavement of free men. Its productiveness impoverishes them. A good working woman makes with her needles only 5 meshes a minute, while certain circular knitting machines make 30,000 in the same time. Every minute of the machine is thus equivalent to 100 hours of the working woman's labor, or again, every minute of the machine's labor gives the working women 10 days of rest. What is true for the knitting industry is more or less true for all industries reconstructed by modern machinery. But what do we see? In portion, as the machine is improved and performs man's work with an ever-increasing rapidity and exactness, the laborer, instead of prolonging his former rest times, redoubles his ardor, as if he wished to rival the machine. Oh, absurd and murderous competition! That the competition of man and the machine might have free course, the proletarians have abolished wise laws which limited the labor of the artisans of the ancient guilds. They have suppressed the holidays, because the producers of that time worked but 5 days out of 7. Are we to believe the stories told by lying economists, that they lived on nothing but air and fresh water? No, so they had leisure to taste the joys of earth, to make love, and to frolic, to banquet joyously in honor of the jovial god of idleness. Gloomy England, immersed in Protestantism, was then called, quote, Merry England, unquote. Rabelaus Quavedo, Cervantes, and the unknown authors of the romances make our mouths water with their pictures of those monumental feasts, with which the men of that time regaled themselves between two battles and two devastations, in which everything, quote, went by the barrel, unquote. Jordaeans of the Flemish school have told the story of these feasts in their delightful pictures, where, oh, where are the sublime gargantuan stomachs of those days? Where are the sublime brains encircling all human thought? We have indeed grown puny and degenerate. Embalmed beef, potatoes, doctored wine, and Prussian schnapps, judiciously combined with compulsory labor, have weakened our bodies and narrowed our minds, and the times when man cramps his stomach and the machine enlarges its output are the very times when the economists preach to us as the Malthusian theory, the religion of abstinence, and the dogma of work. Really, it would be better to pluck out such tongues and throw them to the dogs, because the working class, with its simple good faith, has allowed itself to be thus indoctrinated, because with its native impetuosity, it has blindly hurled itself into work and abstinence. The capitalist class has found itself condemned to laziness and forced enjoyment, to unproductiveness and overconsumption. But if the overwork of the laborer bruises his flesh and tortures his nerves, it is also fertile in griefs for the capitalist. The abstinence to which the productive class condemns itself obliges the capitalists to devote themselves to the overconsumption of the products turned out so righteously by the laborers. At the beginning of capitalist production, a century or two ago, the capitalist was a steady man of reasonable and peaceable habits. He contented himself with one wife or two thereabouts. He contented himself with one wife or thereabouts. He drank only when he was thirsty and ate only when he was hungry. He left to the lords and ladies of the court the noble virtues of debauchery. Today, every son of the newly rich makes it incumbent upon himself to cultivate the disease for which quicksilver is a specific, in order to justify the labors imposed upon the workmen in quicksilver mines. Every capitalist crams himself with capons stuffed with truffles and with the choicest brands of wine in order to encourage the breeders of blooded poultry and the growers of bordelaise. In the occupation, the organism rapidly becomes shattered, the hair falls out, the gums shrink away from the teeth, the body becomes deformed, the stomach obtrudes abnormally, respiration becomes difficult, the motions become labored, the joints become stiff, the fingers knotted, others too feeble in body to endure the fatigues of debauchery, but endowed with the bump of philanthropic discrimination dry up their brains over political economy or juridical philosophy in elaborating thick, soporific books to employ the leisure hours of compositors and pressmen. The women of fashion live a life of martyrdom in trying on and showing off the fairy-like toilets which the seamstresses die in making. They shift like shuttles from morning until night, from one gown into another. For hours together they give up their hollow heads to the artists in hair, who at any cost insist on assuaging their passion for the construction of false chignons, bound in their corsets, pinched in their boots, decollet to make a coal miner blush. They whirl around the whole night through at their charity balls in order to pick up a few cents for poor people, sanctified souls. To fulfill his double social function of non-producer and overconsumer, the capitalist was not only obliged to violate his modest taste, to lose his laborious habits of 2 centuries ago, and to give himself up to unbounded luxury, spicy indigestibles and syphilitic debauches, but also to withdraw from productive labor an enormous mass of men in order to enlist them as his assistants. Here are a few figures to prove how colossal is this waste of productive forces. According to the census of 1861, the population of England and Wales comprised 20,066,244 persons, 9,776,259 male, and 10,289,965 female. If we deduct those too old of too young to work, the unproductive women, boys and girls, then the, quote, ideological professions, unquote, such as governors, policemen, clergy, magistrates, soldiers, prostitutes, artists, scientists, etc. Next, the people exclusively occupied with eating the labor of others under the form of land rent, interest, dividends, etc. There remains a total of 8 million individuals of both sexes and of every age, including the capitalists who function in production, commerce, finance, etc. Out of these 8 millions, the figures run: agricultural laborers, including 1,098,261 herdsmen, servants and farmers, daughters living at home, factory workers in cotton wool, 642,607, hemp, linen, silk, knitting, mine workers, 565,835, metal workers, quote, parentheses, blast furnaces, rolling mills, etc., on parentheses, 396,998. Domestics, 1,208,648. Quote, if we add together the textile workers and the miners, we obtain the figures of 2,208,442. If to the former we add the metal workers, we have a total of 1,039,605 persons, that is to say, in in each case of number below that of the modern domestic slaves, behold the magnificent result of the capitalist exploitation of machines, unquote. To this class of domestics, the size of which indicates the stage attained by capitalist civilization, must still be added the enormous class of unfortunates devoted exclusively to satisfying the vain and expensive tastes of the rich dasses. Diamond cutters, lace makers, embroiders, binders of luxurious books, seamstresses employed on expensive gowns, decorators of villas, etc. Once settled down into absolute laziness and demoralized by enforced enjoyment, the capitalist class, in spite of the injury involved in its new kind of life, adapted itself to it. Soon it began to look upon any change with horror. The sight of the miserable conditions of life resignedly accepted by the working class, and the sight of the organic degradation engendered by the depraved passion for work increased its aversion for all compulsory labor and all restrictions of its pleasures. It is precisely at this time that, without taking into account the demoralization which the capitalist class had imposed upon itself as a social duty, the proletarians took it into their heads to inflict work on the capitalists. Artless as they were, they took seriously the theories of work proclaimed by the economists and moralists, and girded up their loins to inflict the practice of these theories upon the capitalists. The proletariat hoisted the banner, quote, "He who will not work, neither shall he eat," unquote. Lyons, in 1831, rose up for the bullets of work. The Federated Laborers of March 1871 called their uprising, quote, "the revolution of work," unquote. To these outbreaks of barbarous fury, destructive of all capitalist joy and laziness, the capitalists had no other answer than ferocious repression, but they know that if they have been able to repress these revolutionary explosions, they have not drowned in the blood of these gigantic massacres the absurd idea of the proletariat wishing to inflict work upon the idle and reputable classes. And it is to avert this misfortune that they surround themselves with guards, policemen, magistrates, and jailers. Supported in laborious unproductiveness, there is no more room for illusion as to the function of modern armies. They are permanently maintained only to suppress the, quote, "enemy within," unquote. Thus the forts of Paris and Lyons have not been built to defend the city against the foreigner, but to crush it in case of revolt. And if an unanswerable example be called for, we mention the army of Belgium, that paradise of capitalism. Its neutrality is guaranteed by the European powers, and nevertheless its army is one of the strongest in proportion to its population. The glorious battlefields of the brave Belgian army are the plains of the Borinage and the Charleroi. It is in the blood of the unarmed miners and laborers that the Belgian officers temper their swords and win their epaulets. The nations of Europe have not national armies, but mercenary armies. They protect the capitalists against the popular fury, which would condemn them to 10 hours of mining or spinning. Again, while compressing its own stomach, the working class has developed abnormally the stomach of the capitalist class, condemned to overconsumption. For alleviation of its painful labor, the capitalist class has withdrawn from the working class a mass of men far superior to those still devoted to useful production, and has condemned them in their turn to unproductiveness and overconsumption. But this troop of useless mouths, in spite of its insatiable voracity, does not suffice to consume all the goods which the laborers brutalized by the dogma of work produce like madmen, without wishing to consume them, and without even thinking whether people will be found to consume them. This double madness of the laborers, killing themselves with overproduction and vegetating in abstinence, the great problem of capitalist production is no longer to find producers and to multiply their powers, but to discover consumers, to excite their appetites and create in them fictitious needs. Since the European laborers, shivering with cold and hunger, refuse to near the stuffs they weave, to drink the wines from the vineyards they tend, the poor manufacturers, in their goodness of heart, must run to the ends of the earth to find people to wear the clothes and drink the wines. Europe exports every year goods amounting to billions of dollars to the four corners of the earth, to nations that have no need. To nations that have no need of them, but the explored continents are no longer vast enough. Virgin countries are needed. European manufacturers dream night and day of Africa, of a lake in the Saharan desert, of a railroad to the Sudan. They anxiously follow the progress of Livingston, Stanley, du Chaillu. They listen open-mouthed to the marvelous tales of these brave travelers. What unknown wonders are contained in the, quote, dark continent, unquote. Fields are sown with elephants' teeth, with elephants' teeth. Rivers of coconut oil are dotted with gold. Millions of backsides, as bare as the faces of Dufair and Girardin, are awaiting cotton goods to teach them decency, and bottles of schnapps, and Bibles from which they may learn the virtues of civilization. But all to no purpose. The overfed capitalist, the servant class greater in numbers than the productive class, the foreign and barbarous nations, gorged with European goods, nothing can melt away the mountains of products heaped up higher and more enormous than the pyramids of Egypt. The productiveness of European laborers defies all consumption, all waste. The manufacturers have lost their bearings and know not which way to turn. They can no longer find the raw material to satisfy the lawless, depraved passion of their laborers for work. In our woolen districts, dirty and half-rotten rags are raveled out to use in making certain clothes sold under the name of Renaissance, which have about the same durability as the promises made to voters. At Lyons, instead of leaving the silk fiber in its natural simplicity and suppleness, it is loaded down with mineral salts, which, while increasing its weight, make it friable and far from durable. All our products are adulterated to aid in their sale and shorten their life. Our epoch will be called the, quote, age of adulteration, unquote, just as the first epochs of humanity received the names of, quote, the age of stone, unquote, quote, the age of bronze, unquote, from the character of their production. Certain ignorant people accuse our pious manufacturers of fraud, while in reality the thought which animates them is to furnish work to their laborers, who cannot resign themselves to living with their arms folded. These adulterations, whose sole motive is a humanitarian sentiment, but which bring splendid profits to the manufacturers who practice them, if they are disastrous for the quality of the goods, if they are an inexhaustible source of waste in human labor, nevertheless prove the ingenious philanthropy of the capitalists and the horrible perversion of the laborers, who, to gratify their vice for work, oblige the manufacturers to stifle the cries of their conscience and to violate even the laws of commercial honesty. And nevertheless, in spite of the overproduction of goods, in spite of the adulteration in manufacturing, the laborers encumber the market in countless numbers, imploring work. Their superabundance ought to compel them to bridle their passion. On the contrary, it carries it to the point of paroxysm. Let a chance for work present itself. Thither they rush. Then they demand 12, 14 hours to glut their appetite for work, and the next day they are again thrown out on the pavement with no more food for their vice. Every year, in all industries, lockouts occur with the regularity of the seasons. Overwork, destructive of the organism, is succeeded by absolute rest during 2 or 4 months. And when work ceases, the pittance ceases. Since the vice of work is diabolical, attached to the heart of the laborers, since its requirements stifle all the other instincts of nature, since the quantity of work required by society is necessarily limited by consumption and by the supply of raw materials, why devour in 6 months the work of a whole year? Why not distribute it informally over the 12 months and force every working man to content himself with 6 or 5 hours a day throughout the year, instead of getting indigestion from 12 hours during 6 months? Once assured of their daily portion of work, the laborers will no longer be jealous of each other, no longer fight to snatch away work from each other's hands and bread from each other's mouths. And then, not exhausted in body and mind, they will begin to practice the virtues of laziness. Brutalized by their vice, the laborers have been unable to rise to the conception of this fact, that to have work for all, it is necessary to apportion it, like water on a ship like a ship in distress. Meanwhile, certain manufacturers, in the name of capitalist exploitation, have for a long time demanded a legal limitation of the workday before the Commission of 1860 on Professional Education. One of the greatest manufacturers of Alsace, M. Borchardt of Guebwiller, declared, quote, The day of 12 hours is excessive and ought to be reduced to 11, while work ought to be stopped at 2 o'clock on Saturday. I advise the adoption of this measure, although it may appear onerous at first sight. We have tried it in our industrial establishments for 4 years and find ourselves the better for it, while the average production, far from having diminished, has increased, unquote. In his study of machines, M.F. Passy quotes the following letter from a great Belgian manufacturer, M. Odever, quote, "Our machines, although the same as those of the English spinning mills, do not produce what they ought to produce, or what those same machines would produce in England. Although the spinners there work 2 hours a day less, we all work 2 good hours too much. I am convinced that if we worked only 11 hours instead of 13, we should have the same product, and we should consequently produce more economically," unquote. Again, Emily Roy Bolu affirms that it is a remark of a great Belgian manufacturer that the weeks in which a holiday falls results in a product not less than ordinary weeks. An aristocratic government has dared to do what a people duped in their simplicity by the moralists never dared, despising the lofty and moral industrial considerations of the economists who, like the birds of ill omen, croaked that to reduce by 1 hour the work in factories was to decree the ruin of English industry. The government of England has forbidden by a law strictly enforced to work more than 10 hours a day, and as before, England remains the first industrial nation of the world. The experiment tried on so great a scale is on record. The experience of certain intelligent capitalists is on record. They prove beyond a doubt that to strengthen human production it is necessary to reduce the hours of labor and multiply the pay days and feast days. Yet the French nation is not convinced. But if the miserable reduction of 2 hours has increased English production by almost 1/3 in 10 years, what breathless speed would be given to French production by a legal limitation of the working day to 3 hours? Cannot the laborers understand that by overworking themselves, they exhaust their own strength and that of their progeny? That they are used up and long before their time come to be incapable of any work at ale. That absorbed and brutalized by this single vice, they are no longer men, but pieces of men. That they kill within themselves all beautiful faculties, to leave nothing alive and flourishing except the furious madness for work. Like Arcadian parrots, they repeat the lesson of the economist. Quote, let us work to increase the national wealth, unquote. O idiots, it is because you work too much that the industrial equipment develops slowly. Stop braying and listen to an economist, no other than M.L. Raybaud, whom we were fortunate enough to lose a few months ago. Quote, "It is in general by the conditions of handwork that the revolution in methods of labor is regulated. As long as handwork furnishes its services at a low price, it is lavished, while efforts are made to economize it when its services become more costly." Unquote. To force the capitalists to improve their machines of wood and iron, it is necessary to raise wages and diminish the working hours of the machines of flesh and blood. Do you ask for do you ask for proofs? They can be furnished by the hundreds. In spinning, the self-acting mule was invented and applied at Manchester because the spinners refused to work such long hours as before. In America, the machine is invading all branches of farm production, from the making of butter to the weeding of wheat. Why? Because the American, free and lazy, would prefer 1,000 deaths to the bovine life of the French peasant. Plowing, so painful and so crippling to the laborer in our glorious France, is in the American West an agreeable open-air pastime which he practices in a sitting posture, smoking his pipe nonchalantly. And then we have footnotes here. So it says, 1. Under the old regime, the laws of the church guaranteed the laborer 90 rest days, 52 Sundays, and 38 holidays, during which he was strictly forbidden to work. This was the great crime of Catholicism, the principal cause of the irreligion of the industrial and commercial bourgeoisie. Under the Revolution, when once it was in the saddle, it abolished the holidays and replaced the week of 7 days by that of 10, in order that the people might no longer have more than one rest day out of the 10. It emancipated the laborers from the yoke of the church in order the better to subjugate them under the yoke of work. The hatred against the holidays does not appear until the modern industrial and commercial bourgeoisie takes definite form, between the 15th and 16th centuries. Henry IV asked of the Pope that they be reduced. He refused because, quote, "one of the current heresies of the day is regarding feasts," unquote. Parentheses, letters of Cardinal Dosat, on parentheses. But in 1666, Preface, Archbishop of Paris, suppressed 17 of them in his diocese. Protestantism, which was the Christian religion adapted to the new industrial and commercial needs of the bourgeoisie, was less solicited for the people's rest. It dethroned the saints in heaven in order to abolish their feast days on earth. Religious reform and philosophical free thought were but pretexts which permitted the Jesuitical and rapacious bourgeoisie to pilfer the feast days of the people. 2. These gigantic feasts lasted for weeks. Don Rodrigo de Lara wins his bride by expelling the Moors from old Calatrava, and the Romancero relates the story. And I'm probably going to butcher this because this looks like this is pretty much all Spanish right here. It says, Les Bodas, Ferron en Burgos, Las Tornabodas en Salas, en Bodas y Tornabodas, Pasaron, Slet, Semanes, Tantas, vienen de las gentes que no caben por las plazas. Parentheses, the wedding was at Borges, the inferring at Salas, and the wedding and the inferring 7 weeks were spent. So many people came that the town could not hold them, on parentheses. The men of these 7 weeks weddings were the heroic soldiers of the wars of independence. Were the heroic soldiers of the wars of independence. 3. Karl Marx's Capital. 4. The proportion in which the population of the country is employed as domestics in the service of the wealthy class indicates its progress in national wealth and civilization, unquote. Parentheses, R.M. Martin, Ireland before and after the Union 1818, on parentheses. Gambetta, who has denied that there was a social question ever since he ceased to be the poverty-stricken lawyer of the Café Procope, undoubtedly alluded to this ever-increasing domestic class when he announced the advent of new social strata. 5. 2 examples. The English government to satisfy the peasants of India, who in spite of the periodical famines desolating their country, insist on cultivating poppies instead of rice or wheat, has been obliged to undertake bloody wars in order to impose upon the Chinese government the free entry of Indian opium. The savages of Polynesia, in spite of the morality resulting from it, are obliged to clothe themselves in the English fashion in order to consume the products of the Scotch distilleries and the Manchester cotton mills. 6. Paul Leroy Beaulieu, I really don't know how, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but I'm assuming it's Beaulieu or Beaulieu. La question ouvert ou trying to see what Roman numeral that is. I think it's 19. Yeah, I think 19. Cecil, 1872. 7. Louis Raybaud, Le Coton sans régime, ses problèmes, 1863. Chapter 4. New Songs to New Music. We have seen that by diminishing the hours of labor, new mechanical forces will be conquered for social production. Furthermore, by obliging the laborers to consume their products, the army of workers will become immensely increased. The capitalist class, once revealed from its function of universal consumer, will hasten to dismiss its train of soldiers, magistrates, journalists, procurers, which it has withdrawn from useful labor to help it in consuming and wasting. Then the labor market will overflow. Then will be required an iron law to put a limit on work. It will be impossible to find employment for that swarm of former unproductives, more numerous than insect parasites, and after them must be considered all those who provide for their needs and their vain and expensive tastes. When there are no more lackeys and generals to decorate, no more free and married prostitutes to be covered with laces, no more cannons to bore, no more palaces to build, there will be need of severe laws to compel the working women and working men who have been employed on embroidered laces, iron workings, buildings, to take the hygienic and calisthenic exercises requisite to reestablish their health and improve their race. When once we begin to consume European products at home instead of sending them to the devil, it will be necessary that the sailors, dock handlers, and the draymen sit down and learn to twirl their thumbs. The happy Polynesians may then love as they like without fearing the civilized Venus and the sermons of European moralists. And that is not all. In order to find work for all the non-producers of our present society, in order to leave room for the industrial equipment to go on developing indefinitely, the working class will be compelled, like the capitalist class, to do violence to its taste for abstinence and to develop indefinitely its consuming capabilities. Instead of eating an ounce or two of gristly meat once a day, when it eats any, it will eat juicy beefsteaks of a pound or two instead of drinking moderately of bad wine. It will become more orthodox than the Pope and will drink broad and deep bumpers of Bordeaux and Burgundy without commercial baptism and will leave water to the beasts. The proletarians have taken into their heads to inflict upon the capitalists 10 hours of forge and factory. That is their great mistake, because of social antagonisms and civil wars. Work ought to be forbidden and not imposed. The Rothschilds and other capitalists should be allowed to bring testimony to the fact that throughout their whole lives they have been perfect vagabonds. And if they swear they wish to continue to live as perfect vagabonds in spite of the general mania for work, they should be pensioned and should receive every morning at the City Hall a $5 gold piece for their pocket money. Social discords will vanish. Bondholders and capitalists will be first to rally to the popular party. Once convinced that far from wishing them harm, its purpose is rather to relieve them of the labor of overconsumption and waste, with which they have been overwhelmed since their birth. As for the capitalists who are incapable of proving their title of the name of vagabond, they will be allowed to follow their instincts. There are plenty of disgusting occupations in which to place them. Du Fer might be set at cleaning public closets. Galifet might perform surgical operations on diseased horses and hogs. The members of the Amnesty Commission might be sent to the stockyards to pick out the oxen and the sheep to be slaughtered. The senators might play the part of undertakers and lackeys in funeral processions. As for the others, occupations could be found for them on a level with their intelligence. Lord Gerrill and Aerogly could cork champagne bottles, only they would have to be muzzled as a precaution against intoxication. Ferry, Freycinet, and Tirard might destroy the bugs and vermin in the departments of state and other public houses. It would, however, be necessary to put the public funds out of the reach of the capitalists out of due regard for their acquired habits. But vengeance, harsh and prolonged, will be heaped upon the moralists who have perverted nature, the bigots, the cantors, the hypocrites, plus, and others, such sects of men who disguise themselves like maskers to deceive the world. For whilst they give the common people to understand that they are bruised about nothing, but contemplation and devotion in fastings and maceration of their sensuality, and that only to sustain and aliment the small frailty of their humanity. It is so far otherwise that, on the contrary, God knows what cheer they make. Et curies simulant sed bacchanalia vivant. You may read it in great letters, in the coloring of their red snouts, in gouching bellies, as big as a ton, unless it be when they perfume themselves with sulfur, plus, on the days of great popular rejoicing, when instead of swallowing dust, as on the 15th of August and 14th of July under capitalism, the communists and collectivists will eat, drink, and dance to their heart's content. The members of the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, the priests with long robes and short of the economic Catholic Protestant, Jewish, positivist, and free thought church, the propagandists of Malthusianism and of Christian altruistic, independent, or dependent ethics, clothed in yellow, shall be compelled to hold a candle until it bums their fingers, shall starve in sight of tables loaded with meats, fruits, and flowers, and shall agonize with thirst in sight of flowering hogsheads. 4 times a year, with the changing seasons, they shall be shut up like the knife grinders, dogs in great wheels, and condemned to grind wind for 10 hours. The lawyers and legislators shall suffer the same punishment. Under the regime of idleness to kill the time, which kills us second by second, there will be shows and theatrical performances, always and always. And here we have the very work for our bourgeois legislators. We shall organize them into traveling companies to go to the fairs and villages, giving legislative exhibitions. The generals in riding boots, their breasts brilliantly decorated with medals and crosses, shall go through the streets and courts, levying recruits among the good people. Gambetta and his comrade Casagnac shall tend door. Casagnac, in full duelist costume, rolling his eyes and twisting his mustache, spitting out burning tow, shall threaten everyone with his father's pistol, and sink into a hole as soon as they show him Luliere's portrait. Gambetta will discourse on foreign politics, and on little Greece, who makes a doctor of him and would set Europe on fire to pilfer Turkey, on great Russia that stultifies him with the mincemeat she promises to make of Prussia, and who would fain see mischief brewing in the west of Europe, so as to so as to feather her nest in the east and to strangle nihilism at home, on Mr. Bismarck, who was good enough to allow him to pronounce himself on the amnesty, then uncovering his mountainous belly, smeared over with red and white and blue, the three national colors, he will beat the tattoo on it, and enumerate the delicate little ortolans, the truffles and the glasses of Marxot and Joachim, that it has gulped down to encourage agriculture and to keep his electors of Belleville in good spirits. In the barracks, the entertainment will open with the plus electoral farce plus, in the presence of the voters with wooden heads and asses' ears. The bourgeois candidates, dressed as clowns, will dance the dance of political liberties, wiping themselves fore and aft with their freely promising electoral programs, and talking with tears in their eyes of the miseries of the people, and with copper in their voices of the glories of France. Then the heads of the voters will bray solidly in chorus, he han, he han. Then will start the great play, the theft of the nation's goods. Capitalist France, an enormous female, hairy-faced and bald-headed, fat, flabby, puffy, and pale, with sunken eyes, sleepy and yawning, is stretching herself out on a velvet couch. At her feet, industrial capitalism, a gigantic organism of iron with an ape-like mask, is mechanically devouring men, women, and children, whose thrilling and heart-rending cries fill the air. The bank with a marten's muzzle, a hyena's body, and harpy hands is nimbly flipping coins out of his pocket. Hordes of miserable, emaciated proletarians in rags, escorted by gendarmes with drawn sabers, pursued by furies, lashing them with whips of hunger, are bringing to the feet of capitalist France heaps of merchandise, casks of wine, sacks of gold and wheat. Langlois, his neither garment in one hand, the testament of Proudhon in the other, and the book of the national budget between his teeth, is encamped at the head of the defenders of national property and is mounting guard. When the laborers, beaten with gun stocks and pricked with bayonets, have laid down their burdens, they are driven away, and the door is opened to the manufacturers, merchants, and bankers. They hurl themselves pell-mell upon the heap, devouring cotton goods, sacks of wheat, ingots of gold, emptying casks of wine. When they have devoured all they can, they sink down, filthy and disgusting objects, in their ordure and vomitings. Then the thunder bursts forth, the earth shakes and opens. Historic destiny arises. With her iron foot, she crushes the heads of the capitalists, hic coughing, staggering, falling, unable to flee, with her broad hand she overthrows capitalist France, astounded and sweating with fear. If uprooting from its heart the vice which dominates it and degrades its nature, the working class were to arise in its terrible strength, not to demand the rights of man, which are but the rights of capitalist exploitation, not to demand the right to work, which is but the right to misery, but to forge a brazen law forbidding any man to work more than 3 hours a day. The earth, the old earth, trembling with joy, would feel a new universe leaping within her. But how should we ask a proletariat corrupted by capitalist ethics to make a manly resolution? Like Christ, the doleful personification of ancient slavery, the men, the women, and the children of the proletariat have been climbing painfully for a century up the hard calvary of pain. For a century, compulsory toil has broken their bones, bruised their flesh, tortured their nerves. For a century, hunger has torn their entrails and their brains. O laziness, have pity on our long misery. O laziness, mother of the arts and noble virtues, be thou the balm of human anguish. And then there's footnotes here. It says, 1. Galifet was the general who was directly responsible for the massacre of thousands of French working men at the closing days of the Paris Commune. 2. They simulate curious but live like bacchanals, parentheses, juvenile, on parentheses. 3. Rabelais, Pantagruel, Book 2, Chapter 34, translation, or Urquhart and Moteau. 4. Paul de Cassagnac, like his father, Orsner was prominent as a conservative politician, journalist, and duelist. Appendix. Our moralists are a very modest people. If they invented the dogma of work, they still have doubts of its efficacy in tranquilizing the soul, rejoicing the spirit, and maintaining the proper functioning of the entrails and other organs. They wish to try its workings on the populace in animissa vili, before turning it against the capitalists to excuse and authorize whose vices is their peculiar mission. But you, 3 for a cent philosophers, why thus cudgel your brains to work out in ethics the practice of which you dare not console to your masters? Your dogma of work, of which you are so proud, do you wish to see it scoffed at, dishonored? Let us open the history of ancient peoples and the writings of their philosophers and lawgivers. Quote, I could not affirm, unquote, says the father of history, Herodotus, quote, whether the Creeks derive... Does that seriously say Creeks? Yeah, Creeks. Whether the Creeks derived from the Egyptians the contempt which they have for work, because I find the same contempt established among the Thracians, the Scythians, the Persians, the Lydians. In a word, because among most barbarians, those who learn mechanical arts and even their children are regarded as the meanest of their citizens. All the Greeks have been nurtured in this principle, particularly the this is a long word right here, or name actually, Lacedaemonians, unquote. Quote, at Athens the citizens were veritable nobles who had to concern themselves but with the defense and the admiration of the community, like the savage warriors from whom they descended, since they must thus have all their time free to watch over the interests of the Republic. With their mental and bodily strength, they laid all labor upon the slaves. Likewise, at Lacedaemon, even the women were not allowed to spin or weave, that they might not detract from their nobility, unquote. The Romans recognized but two noble and free professions, agriculture and arms. All these citizens by right lived at the expense of the treasury without being constrained to provide for the living by any of their sordid arts. Parentheses, thus, they designated the trades, on parentheses, which rightfully belonged to slaves. The elder Brutus, to arouse the people, accused Tarquin, the tyrant, of the special outrage of having converted free citizens into artisans and masons. The ancient philosophers had their disputes upon the origin of ideas, but they agreed when it came to the abhorrence of work, quote, nature, unquote, said Plato in his Social Utopia, his model republic, quote, nature has made no shoemaker nor smith. Such occupations degrade the people who exercise them. Vile mercenaries, nameless wretches, who are by their very condition excluded from political rights. As for the merchants accustomed to lying and deceiving, they will be allowed in the city only as a necessary evil. The citizen who shall have degraded himself by the commerce of the shop shall be prosecuted for this offense. If he is convinced, if he is convicted, he shall be condemned to a year in prison. The punishment shall be doubled for each repeated offense, unquote. In his Economics, Xenophon writes, quote, the people who give themselves up to manual labor are never promoted to public offices, and with good reason. The greater part of them condemned to be seated the whole day long, some even to endure the heat of the fire continually cannot fail to be changed in body, and it is almost inevitable that the mind be affected, unquote. Quote, what honorable thing can come out of a shop, unquote, asks Cicero. Quote, what can commerce produce in the way of honor? Everything called shop is unworthy an honorable man. Merchants can gain no profit without lying. And what is more shameful than falsehood? Again, we must regard as something base and vile the trade of those who sell their toil and industry, for whoever gives his labor for money sells himself and puts himself in the ranks of slaves, unquote. Proletarians brutalized by the dogma of work listen to the voice of these philosophers, which has been concealed from you with jealous care. A citizen who gives his labor for money degrades himself to the rank of slaves. He commits a crime which deserves years of imprisonment. Christian hypocrisy and capitalist utilitarianism had not perverted these philosophers of the ancient republics. Speaking for free men, they expressed their thought naively. Plato, Aristotle, those intellectual giants beside whom our latter-day philosophers are but pygmies, with the citizens of their ideal republics to live in the most complete leisure, for, as Xenophon observed, quote, work takes all the time, and with it one has no leisure for the republic and his friends, unquote. According to Plutarch, the great claims of LaFargue, wisest of men, to the admiration of posterity, was that he had granted leisure to the citizens of Sparta by forbidding to them any trade whatever. But our moralists of Christianity and capitalism will answer, quote, these thinkers and philosophers praised the institution of slavery, unquote. Perfectly true, but could it have been otherwise? Granted the economic and political conditions of their epoch, war was the normal state of ancient societies. The free man was obliged to devote his time to discussing the affairs of state and watching over its defense. The trades were then too primitive and clumsy for those practicing them to exercise their birthright of soldier and citizen. Thus, the philosophers and lawgivers, if they wished to have warriors and citizens in their heroic republics, were obliged to tolerate slaves. But do not the moralists and economists of capitalism praise wage labor, the modern slavery, and to what men does the capitalist slavery give leisure? To people like Rothschild, Schneider, and Madame Bouscat, useless and harmful slaves of their vices and of their domestic servants. Quote, the prejudice of slavery dominated the minds of Pythagoras and Aristotle, unquote. This has been written disdainfully, and yet Aristotle foresaw, quote, that if every tool could by itself execute its proper function, as the masterpieces of Daedalus moved themselves, or as the tripods of Vulcan set themselves spontaneously at their sacred work, if, for example, the shuttles of the weavers did their own weaving, the foreman of the workshop would have no more need of helpers, nor the masters of slaves, unquote. Aristotle's dream is our reality, our machines with breath of fire, with limbs of unwavering steel, with fruitfulness, wonderful, inexhaustible, accomplished by themselves, with docility, their sacred labor, and nevertheless, the genius of the great philosophers of capitalism remains dominated by the prejudice of the wage system, worst of slaveries. They do not yet understand that the machine is the savior of humanity, the God who shall redeem man from the sordid arts and from working for hire, the God who shall give them leisure and liberty. And there's some footnotes here. It says, 1 Herodotus, Book 2, 2, Bayet de l'abolition de l'esclavage en Chien en Occident, 1840. 3 Livy, Book 1, 4, Plato's Republic, Book 5, and 5, Cicero's De Officibus, 142. And that is the end of the audiobook. Boy, this was a tough one to get through. So once again, if you could please, forgive my slow reading and mispronunciations. A lot of the words and names in this were French, and I don't speak French, but I did, however, tough out a lot of those tougher words. You probably will notice that a lot of the dialogue in this is not exactly in layman's terms. It is quite Victorian, seeing as this was, of course, written by Paul LaFargue, who was Karl Marx's son-in-law, who married his daughter Laura. Definitely had a interesting little passage towards the end of it of making a bit of an homage to the to the Bible, comparing the proletarians to being like the raptured people in the Book of Revelation, and then the bourgeoisie being compared to who are being purged from the face of the earth. Once again, if you could hit that like and or subscribe button, I would greatly appreciate that, as I will have more of these in the future. And I'm signing off for today. Bye, everyone.